There is something about Boston in the 1970s that stays with people who lived through it. The cold winters that tested your spirit. The neighborhoods where everybody knew your name. The sports teams that broke your heart and then made you believe again. And if someone grew up then, they know exactly what made that decade so unforgettable. This was a time when Boston was wrestling with its identity. The Big Bad Bruins were winning Stanley Cups, with Bobby Orr flying through the air. The busing crisis was tearing the city apart. Faneuil Hall Marketplace was being reborn from decay into something spectacular. And then there was the blizzard of 1978, a storm so devastating that people who lived through it still talk about it like it happened yesterday. This was the decade that gave us championships at the Garden, racial tensions in the streets, the transformation of the waterfront, and winters that tested everything Boston was made of. The old Boston was fading, but what came next would define the city for generations. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like during that unforgettable decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it reveals just how much the city has changed. Let's step into that world. Living in Boston in the 1970s meant living in neighborhoods that felt like small towns within a city. South Boston, commonly called Southie, was Irish Catholic through and through. The North End smelled like fresh bread and marinara sauce from the Italian bakeries and restaurants that lined every narrow street. Beacon Hill had cobblestone streets and gas lamps, and the wealthy lived in brick row houses. Each neighborhood had its own character, its own churches, its own loyalties. Triple-decker homes that defined so many Boston neighborhoods were where families lived stacked on top of each other, grandparents on one floor, parents on another, maybe an aunt and uncle above or below. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Kids played in the streets until the street lights came on. Mothers would lean out windows and holler for their children to come home for dinner. There was no privacy, but there was community. Inside those homes, the look was unmistakably the 1970s. There were Harvest Gold appliances in the kitchen and avocado green refrigerators, shag carpeting that collected everything, wood paneling in the basement where kids would watch television and play. The oil furnace in the basement chugged along all winter, and the smell of heating oil was the smell of home during those brutal cold months. The winters in Boston during the 1970s were legendary, and nothing proved that more than the blizzard of 1978. On February 6, 1978, the forecast called for only 6 inches of snow. By the time it ended, 32 hours later, over 27 inches had fallen. But the snow was only part of the story. That Monday morning, people went to work and school like any other day. The snow came in later than expected, and when it finally hit, it hit hard. Snow fell at 4 inches per hour. Wind gusts reached 83 miles per hour. By afternoon, Route 128 had become a parking lot of stranded vehicles, buried in drifts as high as 15 feet. National Guardsmen waded through waist-deep snow to tap on car windows, checking if drivers were still alive. The entire city shut down for a week. Governor Michael Dukakis banned all travel. People skied down empty streets and walked across the frozen Charles River. Neighbors who had never spoken helped dig each other out. The parking lot at Fenway Park became a staging ground for the National Guard. Nearly 100 people died. The storm caused $500 million in damage. But if you ask anyone who lived through it, they will tell you about the strange beauty of a silent city buried in white. The way neighbors came together. The week off from school that felt like an adventure. The blizzard of 1978 became a defining moment, the storm against which all other Boston storms are still measured. Before we continue with the sports and culture that defined Boston in this era, if you are enjoying this look back at how people really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Americans built the life we know today. Sports in the 1970s in Boston was not entertainment. It was religion. No team captured the spirit of the decade quite like the Big Bad Bruins. Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito led a team that played hockey like it was a contact sport with occasional skating. They were tough. They were talented. They drank hard and played harder. The Bruins won the Stanley Cup in 1970 and again in 1972. Bobby Orr's famous flying goal, when he was tripped just as he scored the Cup winner against St. Louis, became the most iconic image in hockey history. For a city that had suffered through years of losing Bruins teams, those championships meant everything. The players were rock stars. Derek Sanderson was to hockey what Joe Namath was to football. The Celtics were transitioning. Bill Russell had retired in 1969, and the dynasty years seemed over. But under Tommy Heinsohn, with players like Dave Cowens, JoJo White, and John Havlicek, the Celtics won championships in 1974 and 1976. The 1974 finals against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the Milwaukee Bucks went 7 games. The 1976 finals against Phoenix featured a triple overtime game that some call the greatest basketball game ever played. The Red Sox gave Boston one of its most heartbreaking moments in 1975. The World Series against Cincinnati's Big Red Machine went 7 games. Carlton Fisk's home run in Game 6 when he waved the ball fair with his hands is etched in baseball memory. But they lost Game 7. The curse continued. Saturday nights in Boston meant hockey night, and the Garden was the place to be. The old Boston Garden was cramped, loud, and legendary. The parquet floor for Celtics games had dead spots that only the home team knew about. The ice was small, which suited the Bruins' bruising style. The seats were uncomfortable. The sightlines were terrible in places, and nobody who ever went there would trade those memories for anything. But the 1970s in Boston were not just about sports and snowstorms. The decade brought a painful division that would scar the city for years. In 1974, a federal judge ruled that Boston had intentionally segregated its public schools. The remedy was busing. Black students were bused to predominantly white schools, and white students were bused to predominantly black schools. The reaction in neighborhoods like South Boston and Charlestown was violent. Parents threw rocks at buses carrying black children. Riots broke out. Police lined the streets. The national news carried images from Boston that shocked the country. The city that had been the cradle of liberty, the birthplace of the abolitionist movement, was now showing a different face to the world. The busing crisis divided Boston along neighborhood lines that already ran deep. It pitted working-class white families against court orders they saw as imposed by suburban liberals who would never have their own children bused anywhere. It traumatized black children who faced hatred just for going to school. The violence and tension lasted for years. The effects on Boston's public schools and neighborhoods would linger for decades. Shopping and daily life in Boston in the 1970s had its own rhythm. Filene's basement in downtown Boston was legendary. The automatic markdown system meant prices dropped the longer items stayed on the rack. Women would camp out for the bridal gown sale, literally fighting over dresses. The basement was chaos, treasure hunting at its finest. Faneuil Hall Marketplace was being reborn during this decade. For years, Quincy Market had been a decaying wholesale produce market that the city wanted to demolish. But in 1976, a renovation transformed the old granite buildings into something new. A festival marketplace with shops, restaurants, and food stalls. It opened just in time for the bicentennial celebrations and became a model for urban renewal projects across America. The North End remained the heart of Italian Boston. Hanover Street was lined with bakeries, butcher shops, and restaurants that had served the same families for generations. The feast days, especially the Fisherman's Feast and the Feast of St. Anthony, filled the narrow streets with crowds, music, and the smell of sausage and peppers cooking on open grills. Food in Boston neighborhoods was ethnic and traditional. Irish families ate boiled dinner. Italian families made Sunday gravy that simmered all day. The diners served eggs and toast for breakfast, and everyone had a favorite place for clam chowder. Legal seafoods was becoming an institution. The Union Oyster House claimed to be the oldest restaurant in America and served oysters to tourists and locals alike. Getting around Boston in the 1970s meant dealing with traffic that was already terrible and a transit system that was showing its age. The T, Boston Subway, was one of the oldest in the country, and it showed. The Green Line trolleys were packed during rush hour. The station smelled of old metal and oil, but the T connected the neighborhoods to downtown, and for people without cars, it was essential. The Central Artery cut through downtown Boston like an ugly scar, an elevated highway that separated the waterfront from the rest of the city. The big dig that would eventually bury it underground was decades away. For now, the highway created shadow and noise where there should have been connection. Winters meant starting your car early and letting it warm up. Block heaters were essential if you wanted your engine to turn over on mornings when the temperature dropped below zero. Shoveling out your parking space after a snowstorm meant that space was yours, and heaven help anyone who tried to take it. People marked their spots with lawn chairs, trash cans, anything they could find. This was sacred. Television in Boston meant watching channels 4, 5, and 7, and maybe catching the UHF channels if your antenna was positioned right. Evening news was a ritual. Families gathered around the television for programs they watched together. If you missed a show, you missed it. There was no recording, no catching up later. Music filled the city from the clubs and bars that lined Lansdowne Street near Fenway Park. Boston's own Aerosmith was becoming huge. The Cars would emerge by the end of the decade. Disco came to Boston, and clubs pulsed with the sound. But the Irish bars in Southie played traditional music, and the jazz clubs in the South End played something different entirely. What defined Boston in the 1970s was contradiction. It was a city of neighborhoods that distrusted each other but came together when disaster struck. It was a city that cheered black athletes at the Garden while fighting against integration in its schools. It was a city of deep tradition that was being forced to change. The decade saw championships and heartbreak on the field. It saw division and violence in the streets. It saw urban decay and ambitious renewal. It saw winters that tested everyone and summers that made you forget the cold. For those who lived in Boston during the 1970s, it was a time when you knew your neighbors, when parishes were the center of community life, when loyalty to your team meant something almost spiritual. The winters were brutal, the neighborhoods were tight, and the city was changing in ways that nobody could fully control. The Big Bad Bruins gave Boston glory on the ice. The Celtics kept winning even after the Russell era ended. The busing crisis revealed wounds that would take generations to heal. And the blizzard of 1978 buried everything under snow and somehow brought the city together. For those with memories of this remarkable era in one of America's oldest cities, there is always more history to explore.